Welcome to Chapter 2, Verbal Communication. We're going to go through Chapters 2 and 3 today. And, of course, make sure you take a look at the learning objectives for this week's material. A lot of it are, they're located in the book, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but the main thing is making sure you understand these learning objectives. And we've talked about that in previous chapters. I spent a little bit more time, but since we have 2 chapters today, I'm going to kind of move through this a little bit quicker so I don't waste your time. Language is symbolic, right? What is a symbol? It's something that stands in or represents something else. So symbols combine to form language system codes, of course. So in your book on chapter 50, right, it talks about using the letters H-E-L-L-O together, which mean, of course, notifying someone that you're aware that they're there and you're want to engage in conversation with them, right? So moving on to communication as a quality that's unique to humans. The symbolic nature, of course, but of course other types of animals or some groups of that nature also communicate in different ways, but symbolic is very unique to humans. The triangle of meaning, I really like this on chapter 2, page 51. It's a model of communication that indicates the relationship among a thought, symbol, or highlights the direct or indirect relationship between a symbol and a referent. So understand that. It talks about in figure 2.1, the symbol of a dog. I thought the thought, I want to get a dog, and then the referent, an actual dog, which could be a Dachshund Jack Russell Terrier, a mutt, an animal, from the shelter, whatever that might be. And that is here in this triangle of meaning. So make sure you read over this. Of course, it's a model of communication that indicates the relationship among a thought, symbol, and highlights the indirect relationship between the symbol and what you're referring to. All right, so just some really, deep diving details into what meaning is in communication and what it really takes to understand what we're trying to convey to others. All right, some definitions here. I'm not going to go over those, but denotation refers to the definitions that are accepted by a language group, and then the connotation refers to definitions that are based on emotion. So make sure you understand those. I can pretty much tell you they're going to be in a test here in the near future. Of course, we're talking about a test that's at the end of the semester, but make sure you understand those. Language, of course, is learned from early childhood, right? Making sure you're taught grammar and acquisition, and you really develop your language skills based on where you're at, what time people spend with you, and then where you are more likely to learn from others and the type of people you're around. Here's some learning objectives moving on to the functions of language. Make sure you understand these before you move on to the next chapter, right? Language, of course, is expressive, and I'm sure you're aware of this already, but verbal expressions help us communicate observations, thoughts, feelings, and, of course, needs. It's also powerful, right? It can be used in a lot of different variations, how you communicate and express, how you're feeling or the way you want to act is really important, and, it really can help move conversation or a thought process in one direction or in an opposite direction depending on where you want to take your language to. It can be fun, right? It can be funny, and a lot of you know of stand-up comedians. That is a thing because of language, and that is a thing because of communication, and a lot of us can be funny ourselves. So how we display information that we're wanting to convey is important, and part of that is the fun element to it as well. More about page 61, we talk about slang, which is new or adapted words that are specific to a group or context. You see this a lot, especially in social media, communication via text. That's something that should be kept in mind from the perspective of how we develop words. So be sure to look at that on page 61. Communicate with others, right, can show support or can separate us, and you really see that a lot in relationships. So page 63 highlights that. Unsupportive messages are on page 64. global labels like "you're a liar," sarcasm, dragging up the past, negative comparisons, judgmental messages, and threats. So those are all things that can drive people apart, and that's important to realize and know. Not from just a career perspective, but also from a personal perspective. Using words well, how we communicate, and I see this a lot in people who struggle with communication, not specifically in verbal communication, because I think people are naturally better at that because you do it more often, but in written communication, how you write your sentences, your grammar, how things flow in a paper, it's all very important for your career. It's important for your development, and a lot of people don't take it as seriously as they should. So using words clearly, of course, this is going to be in verbal communication, but sentence structure that's clear and easy to understand in written communication is also very important. How do you use words in an effective manner? So what speech are you using? Does words, like a lot of people use a lot of adjectives in their sentence structure. Is that really effective communication? Not ultimately. There's time and place for it, but how you communicate on a scholarly level is very important for your success, and we'll talk more about that when we transition into written communication. Ethics are a big thing, especially from the perspective of making sure you communicate in a way that, not just is effective, but also makes people feel comfortable and understands that everyone comes at things from a different dynamic. So don't use polarizing or swearing language. It's always important. Accountability. You can be held accountable for how you communicate with others. And a lot of times people forget about this. There are laws that hold people accountable for the way they communicate, especially if they say things that might be either A, offensive, or B, can be looked at from the perspective of a risk. So make sure you understand the accountability side of communication. So we're moving on to 2.4, only 3 more slides. Language is social context. Make sure that you understand what the social aspect of communication is and how you communicate in your roles that help your interaction verbally. And then also cultural context is something we'll talk about, I think, in chapter 6. But that's an important part of culture and communication. So not a lot of information here in this chapter, but it wants you to understand that there are more developments to communicating effectively, and we'll go over those in the future. Cultural bias, right? We don't want to have bias when we communicate, especially from the identities that are listed below. That's not something that we want to teach, and that's not something that's going to help you, ever develop as a future communicator or future leader. So moving on to chapter 3 now. I like nonverbal communication. I like studying about it because every time I do, I learn something new. A lot of people don't realize what nonverbal communication is, how we communicate. Not from the perspective of there's just nonverbal and nothing else, but how you're conveying yourself is something that a lot of people overlook, and it's the number one form of communication. I think that's highlighted here in this chapter. Make sure you understand the learning objectives for 3.1. It's a process of generating meaning by using behavior other than words. So paralanguage is a vocalized but not verbal part of speech, such as speaking rate, volume, and pitch. If I scream at you, but I say the same thing as if I'm talking calm and generated at you, then of course the screaming person or the person that screamed is going to be seen as someone that's more aggressive than the one that was calm, even if you said the same thing. To earlier, compared to verbal communication, nonverbal conveys more meaning, it's more involuntary, it's more ambiguous, and it's more credible. So you can really tell how someone is depending on how they convey their meaning nonverbally. So nonverbal communication, of course, conveys meaning by reinforcing, substituting for, or contradicting verbal communication. We talked about someone screaming and saying something nice, but I'm sure you've come into contact with someone who made eye contact in a weird way, had a strange facial expression when they were communicating. Maybe they were tapping their feet during a process where they were communicating to you. You pick up on those things, so it's important to recognize that and understand that's a very important part of communication because it's nonverbal. So skip over objectives 3.2. I don't want to bore you with these. You can read them. It's just the basics of what each thing means. There's definitions here like eye contact, facial expression. A lot of this you're going to already know. Haptics, we could talk about that. Vocalics. Lots of different information here that you need to be aware of, but they're in your text, so I'm not going to bore you with them. We're going to move on to learning objectives 3.3. How to improve competence when sending nonverbal messages. So how do you improve competence? That's a really important factor here. Sending nonverbal messages. When you send a nonverbal message, the goal should be, majority of the time, to help create a positive impression of yourself. So communication that affects someone else's thought process of you should be rehearsed and practiced. Talked about here is mirroring, which refers to the often subconscious practice of using nonverbal cues that match the others around us. So if you see someone, standing in front of a group and they start mirroring the group, a lot of times you see that happen. It's about being accepted. It's about being a part of a team that, really supports us in a way that makes us feel comfortable, right? So transitioning on to listening, when you listen to someone, you feel their emotional contact with you. Sometimes sending nonverbal messages to them in that setting can also be very effective. How to interpret. A lot of times when you're interpreting nonverbal messages as a receiver, you want to understand the context of someone else. So how they're presenting to you. Maybe they've had a rough day. Maybe they're going through a tough personal time. So understanding how that might affect them and how that might change the process of how you think about someone is also very important when you're receiving information as well. Detecting deception. So sometimes truth bias leads us to believe that people are telling the truth, especially when we know and like that person. So, a lot of times this happens in politics, right? You trust someone, you've felt that they've done a good job, and you just want to believe them. And, it happens in other settings as well, personal settings. So understanding and detecting deception from a nonverbal scenario is also very important as an effective communicator. So communication is not just how you convey information, but also how do you receive information and how do you understand how other people might be trying to lead you in a direction that maybe is a good thing, or maybe it's something that you need to keep an eye out for. The objectives 3.4, we talk about something that's really important, and you've highlighted this also in chapter 2, but cultural differences in nonverbal communication. I want to just highlight how important that is. Not every cultural group will communicate the same way, and understanding that the impact that your communication has on others and understanding how they communicate with you is very important, and not everyone's going to be the same. Transition over to professionals. Professionals need to be aware of how context, status, and power intersects with how they communicate with others. So naturally, if the boss walks in the room, they're going to automatically be seen as a figure of power, and the way they communicate really needs to be practiced so they're able to reach those that they want to speak to or want to change an impression of. So men and women too have more similarities than differences in communication, but some of the changes that you're going to see is women using more gestures. Men use larger gestures. Women are more socialized to use more vocal variety than men are, and men are socialized to take up more space. So there are some differences that you need to be aware of. However, like this says, there are also more similarities. So chapter 2 and chapter 3, a lot of information, a lot of basic information as well that you might be aware of. You just haven't heard it in this fashion. I want you to be really rational in your thought process after reading this material and understanding that a lot of it is unique to certain groups like we talked about, but also understanding that we can change and make improvements based on what we learned here today and in the future. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I appreciate all of you, and I look forward to the next review that we do, moving on to the next couple of chapters. Thanks so much.